From the Magna Carta to the Brexit referendum, Britain's relationship with democracy has never been a simple one. But with a younger generation increasingly mistrustful of governments, politicians and the media, could British democracy be in crisis? A recent survey by Channel 4 titled Gen Z, Trends, Truth and Trust showcased that the younger generation is individualistic, fearful and leans towards the authoritarian side of the scale. 52% of respondents said that they thought the country would be better off if it were run by a strong leader who didn't have to bother with parliaments or elections. And nearly half of respondents said that a revolution was needed to undergo radical change in our society. What's perhaps more worrying though is the fact that nearly half of male respondents said that women's rights had gone too far and that they were threatening men's rights. And in bad news for us student journalists, 58% of respondents said that they trusted social media posts and influencers more than traditional news sources. But while these shocking statistics have caused a big stir in national headlines, including a telling off by David Mitchell in The Observer, it's important to understand why Gen Z might be feeling so extreme, whether they are indeed this extreme, what are the reasons behind these trends, and how do we combat the most worrying side effects of them? So are you surprised to find that Gen Z are quite politically extreme in some ways?
I wasn't surprised to find out that I think everything what is happening now in the world is not surprising us anymore. Every day the news shows us that everything is possible, but I would not say that I am with them.
Honestly, no, I'm not surprised. I think that youth is very likely to be disappointed by our democratic leaders, especially over the last few years, so no, I'm not surprised, no.
I don't think they are, but they definitely should be. Things are not looking good. But I think compared to previous generations, there were a lot more politically active students in like our parents' generation.
Why do you think Gen Z might have less trust in like the traditional political governmental system? What do you think the reasons for that might be?
I think the election system in the UK, though distinctly different from the US, is slowly becoming a two-party system, and I think that's causing a lot of division in society. What they see hope in maybe a more authoritarian way of governing is potential unification, because the decision is taken out of almost society's hands, so then it becomes more of a commentary. And I think seeing hope in the unity in, let's say, what happened in Syria, of everyone backing kind of one regime and one vision of hope, maybe they're hoping that a vision like that can help unify the UK, because I think there is a lot of segmentation, mistrust, division and isolation threatening the future of Britain.
We are living in an age now when we are all the more aware that there's only so much time left, and that we have to fight for the future and be aware of that time in a way that maybe previous generations might have not been thinking about.
I think that it's understandable that they wouldn't be hopeful, but I think there's reasons to be. I think that we're in especially a decade where we can actually implement reforms and big change, big infrastructure projects, for example, here in the UK. So I think that there's reasons to be hopeful. We just have to get that message across, because I think that that's not happening.
The UCL students that we spoke to were largely unsurprised about Gen Z's disengagement. But could this really give us the full picture? To find out more, I spoke to Dr. Tom O'Grady, who has written extensively about young people as a voter demographic. He believed that this survey was an outlier and not a true representation of Gen Z's political position. It is true that the headlines surrounding this survey were depicting Gen Z as more authoritarian than they actually are, as many overlook the fact that the survey found that 73% of Gen Z think democracy is a very or fairly good way of governing. Dr. O'Grady did, however, point to the statistics surrounding young men with lower levels of education becoming increasingly far right, and suggested that the online manosphere is a possible explanation for this. Are you surprised to learn that just under half of Gen Z men think that women's rights have gone far enough?
I'm not surprised, and it's something that I, as someone who wants to be a mother one day and maybe might have sons, am also concerned about. I think terms like men are trash or that kind of ideology is actually quite toxic for a society where 50% of the population do identify with that gender. And so I'm not surprised, and I do have a lot of empathy and sympathy and compassion for the male community right now, because I think if you're too masculine you're toxic. If you're too feminine, you're also a different type of strange to society.
I'm not surprised at all. No, I mean, even at a university like this, I mean, I study politics, and sometimes stuff I've heard, like my peers say that a non-woman has been quite like striking. But I mean, I don't want to like quote what people say in seminars, so that's an issue for like departments to deal with. But I think, yeah, there's a massive issue even on campuses. You see with like the rise of like sexual violence, sexual harassment on campuses. I mean, that's not stopped. I mean, a great like report by Our Streets Now, I think it might be a couple of years ago now, or even a year ago, and like the work of like Everyone's Invited has just really highlighted that higher education is a massive, needs to be tackled, like their issues towards sexual harassment and violence on campuses. So I think it's definitely prevalent.
I think it stems from everyone, but men specifically, young men, not feeling like they have a place or direction in society. And so I empathize with a lot of the feelings that cause them to go that direction. However, that's not a good direction to be going in. And I think the left needs to communicate a better idea of what the future looks like and what young men, what their place in the future is.
One of the things that I found most worrying about this study is the fact that nearly half of Gen Z men either believe that women's rights have gone too far or that the women's rights movement is actively discriminating against them as men. As a socialist feminist, what do you make of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, when I saw that statistic, I was so unbelievably surprised. I think sometimes it's very easy to live in an echo chamber where I think that, everybody understands that, the women's rights struggle still has a long way to go. I mean, I think a lot of it comes from, in that same study, there were obviously statistics about how, there are higher amounts of women in education and employment and things like that. And I really just think that it comes from this kind of generation of young boys and men who have been taught through whatever social norms to believe that the world is their oyster in a way that it isn't for women. And then when women have to work harder and reach out and seize those opportunities, which is what you kind of need to do in our society nowadays, then these boys, when they don't do that and then they don't see things being maybe handed to them in a way that they once were, they feel left behind and they don't understand why that is. And then they see women succeed, and that's then where they place the blame.
This concept of men being left behind, as you say, was a big part of the study and is kind of a big part of this idea now that a lot of figures like maybe Andrew Tate, like Jordan Peterson, who a lot of these same young men said that they look up to or they trust on information. How big of a threat do you think figures like that are for Gen Z young people?
Well, I think it's just really, really worrying that a lot of these young men and boys obviously have absolutely nothing in common with people like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, especially from, an economic background. And these people have such a far-reaching platform, and then they spread their toxic views in such a way that makes them palatable for young people because they're understandable, they're in these short little clips. So it's this kind of easily digestible politics. And then they see these people's, amazing lives with the money that they make and things like that, and they think, well, I want that. I'm being left behind. Why can't I have that? And he's telling me that I can, so therefore I will go out and get it, no matter who it means I have to kind of slight in the process.
Is this, so another big part of it was this idea of a zero-sum game, in order for men to succeed, women have to fail, or vice versa. Do you think this is true?
I don't think that it's true in any way, shape or form. I think, we as a society can live in a way where equity and equality exists, and I don't think that for some people to win, others have to lose. I really just think that it means that men have, enjoyed a lot of privilege over the years, and it's not about bringing men down, it's about bringing women up to that level. And I think that maybe just means dismantling some of these privileged patriarchal structures that have meant that they have had the ahead for so long. But then they don't view it as that. They see, women kind of encroaching on what they view as their space. And I think that that's really dangerous because it just, perpetuates the patriarchal idea that that's not for women, and now women are kind of breaking out of something and into a new sphere where they shouldn't be allowed because this is a man's place, and I think that's really dangerous.
So what advice would you give to maybe young women who feel a bit scared and a bit worried about this information? And how do you think we as a society need to go about tackling these ideas, and how do we sort of combat them?
Yeah, well, I think on an individual level for young women, obviously, the burden of responsibility for changing men should not be put upon women, because that's just a further extension of, these patriarchal structures. But I think it's about starting conversation with the men in your lives, even if these aren't people who are maybe particularly right-wing and in love with Andrew Tate or whatever. You know, speaking to your fathers, your friends, your uncles or whatever, who, I mean, I know I have people in my life who I believe hold very similar political views to me, but because, at least in the way that I am and other women are, they don't have to confront these kind of gender biases on a daily basis. They maybe don't see them, and they, you know, society isn't in a place where they feel that they have the need to. So it's about, you know, constantly shedding light on these things and saying, look, I know that maybe you have a perception of my experience, but this is how it actually is. And I think that if we can start, you know, making that the norm, then that will make things a lot easier. On a more societal level, I really think education is just the key to everything. I think that in our schools, we need to, you know, have changes in the curriculum that obviously include more women, and also just in general political education and things like that. But I also think that it's not just about, you know, academics and curriculum. I think it's about creating an environment in primary schools and high schools where women's issues are listened to. Like almost everyone that I talk to, when they speak of kind of issues that they had in their school to do with maybe, you know, sexual assault or kind of gender-based, you know, violence or harassment or whatever, there's always a kind of very lacking response from the school. And I think that that is what is really demoralizing for women, and also makes, you know, men think that they can get away with it, or that some things are acceptable. And I really think that from a young age we need to start kind of teaching our kids that that's not the way it is, and that that's not acceptable.
One need only look at the hippie movements of the 1960s to understand that younger generations have always been depicted as more anti-establishment than their elders. I wanted to find out whether this survey was just a repetition of that history, or whether governments needed to be worried about a generation that is increasingly mistrustful of them.
So is there a historical precedence for this, for younger generations kicking back against liberal democracy?
Yes, I think in the history of British mass democracy, which you can date from 1918, by which point nearly everyone has the vote, or from 1928, by which point all women are enfranchised, there are a couple of periods when British democracy, in the sort of sense that there is a rough and ready consensus underpinning it, really starts to break down. You see that in the 1930s and you see it in the 1970s. And unsurprisingly, one of the groups in society that is affected in both those cases by the crises that are unfolding in the economy and so on is young people. So in the 1930s, you have young people joining the Communist Party. You also have young people joining the British Union of Fascists and other extreme organisations. Now, the numbers involved are much lower than the numbers suggested in these polls. But on the other hand, today we don't have large numbers of people, young people, joining fascist or communist parties and marching through the streets sort of saying so. Similar happened in the 1970s. And again, we don't have that today. So I think there are precedents. I mean, also, if you look at what was happening at the end of the First World War, I mean, you know, we wouldn't necessarily think of them as young people, but the young men coming back from the trenches and the Western Front are very much young people, younger than students in certain cases. And they come back, many of them really quite angry, or become angry very quickly when it becomes clear that the promise that they have been given and the basis on, to some extent, they think they've fought, Attlee talks about this, that they're building a better world, is going to be overturned and broken, and we're going to return to a sort of austerity economics, which happens in the first couple of years after the war. You see gatherings of soldiers in Parliament Square, you know, getting really quite violent, and there's descriptions in the Times of worried MPs looking around the curtains. In the 1930s, you see Aldous Huxley, who, the novelist, who at this point is 34, but would still count in our terms as a young person, sitting in the gallery in the House of Commons, looking down at the debates over the kind of crashing economy and dismissing parliamentary democracy as a whorish old slut, and in quotes, and putting his political faith in authoritarian economic planning. There's a writer called Sir Philip Gibbs, who admittedly is conservative and who may not be totally to be trusted on this story, but claims that he met an Oxford student in the 1930s who said that everybody over 40 should be shot. That was the only way to change anything. And when his wife asked if that included her, he said very sadly, yes, it would. So these things are often sort of in the air when we hit a period of crisis. And I think the reason that happens, or the reason it's significant, is not necessarily because those people literally necessarily want to see a dictatorship. Who wants that? Very few people. But actually, it's a way of expressing discontent in a way that democracy needs to listen to. And if it does listen to it, it can move away from the drivers that are leading to those expressions of fury and disaffection.
So how can the current government kind of deal with this younger generation then that doesn't have this sort of baseline trust in politics and politicians? How can the sort of Labour government actually try and combat this and, I guess, restore faith in some of these things that younger people have lost faith in?
So I think what's important to do is to recognise why people are saying this. Don't engage on the level of democracy and the precise mechanisms of democracy. Engage on the basic reasons why people are feeling this sense of despair. When I was young in the 1990s, there was very, very little talk of this kind because the economy was growing. There was a sense of hope. There was a sense that if you went to university, you could graduate and eventually buy a house, or even though it was getting harder then, there was a sense that you could move forwards in life. And that has gone, and that is what needs to be restored. And what these polls are useful for is as a kind of red flashing warning light on the dashboard of democracy to say this is a problem and you need to address the substantive reasons behind it. So one obvious thing is on housing, and the government is trying to kind of battle with the planning system to get somewhere on that front. Whether relying entirely on a few major, very dominant house builders is the way forwards is open to debate, but that is clearly part of it. I mean, if you look back to 1923, the reason that the term property owning democracy is coined is because after the First World War, there is a sense that you need to give people some sort of stake, some sort of literal kind of part of the land so that they feel part of the democratic system. They don't feel excluded from it. We have the same basic thing now. You have an unfolding crisis, financial crisis in our universities. That's going to start hitting young people very hard, in the wake of all the problems that they had over COVID. That needs addressing. Now, there will be plenty of people, not least perhaps in the Treasury, saying, but it's too difficult, we can't do it, there isn't sufficient money, there are other priorities. Well, if this is the level of disaffection we're seeing with young people, perhaps it needs to move up the priority list. But I think it's also a more perhaps sort of psychological or cultural conversation that needs to happen. I think we need to stop making assumptions about how young people see those in power. I mean, my daughter has just turned 18, and colleagues of hers at school were about to vote in their first general election. And she told me that one said, I'm not going to vote because I don't like Rishi Sunak, subtext meaning I don't like politicians because I don't like this politician. The sense that people don't necessarily have much sort of introduction or welcome into the world of what the Americans would call civics, of how democracy works, I think would help. But also, actually, I think some sense, a greater sense of the history of how democratic politics has made people's lives better would be quite helpful. I mean, looking at the GCSE and A-level syllabus, I see fewer signs, even in different iterations of it, fewer signs than perhaps I think would be worth it of, teaching the basic things that democratic politics has done. No particular party. We could talk about Harold Macmillan building houses as a Conservative in the 1950s. We could talk about Labour building the National Health Service. We could talk about the Liberals introducing early versions of welfare, the welfare state in the Edwardian era. But some sense that it is worth it because it makes life better, and we can show you that because it's what's happened all the way through, would, I think, really help. And I think alongside that, engaging with the kind of stories that people tell about what power looks like. Again, I think conspiracy theory, the kind of stuff you see in the manosphere, the idea that, everything is just a kind of an evil stitch-up, an evil plot to exploit or marginalize people, that needs to be engaged with, not in the sense of believing it, but also just not in the sense of debunking it. Try to understand the narrative that people are telling about power, where they see themselves in it, and then engage with that and try to change that to something that's both more accurate and also more hopeful, and might bring people back into the idea that, along with some actual delivery, as I say, democracy can actually make your life better. And as Churchill said, it's the worst alternative except for all the others.